I didn't know what to expect on my first night at Ridgeway Manor, a quiet little nursing home tucked away in a sleepy Ohio town. I'd worked a few odd jobs before, warehouse shifts, cashier work, even a brief stint at a gas station, but this was my first time as a night shift nursing assistant. I figured it would be peaceful, help a few elderly residents, do my rounds, maybe even get some reading in during the slower hours. I was wrong. The place was bigger than I expected. A sprawling two-story building with long, dimly lit hallways that smelled like disinfectant and old fabric. When I arrived at 10 p.m., the day shift was shuffling out, looking drained. I was greeted by Margaret, the night supervisor, an older woman with sharp eyes and a tired but kind expression. "Welcome to Ridgeway," she said, handing me a clipboard with my rounds schedule. "It's usually quiet at night, but there are a few residents you'll want to keep an eye on." She flipped through the pages before tapping her pen on one name. "Mr. Holloway, room 213. I glanced at the notes beside his name. "Confused at night. Claims to see his deceased wife." Margaret sighed. "Holloway's harmless, but, well, he gets turned around sometimes. Thinks his wife is still with him. Talks to her, swears he sees her out the window." She gave me a look. "If he gets agitated, just sit with him for a bit. He usually calms down." I nodded. Seems simple enough. By 11 p.m., most of the residents were in bed, and the hallways had that eerie, unnatural stillness that comes when too many people are sleeping under the same roof. The overhead fluorescents buzzed softly, and every creak of the old wooden floors seemed too loud. I made my first round, walking the length of the corridor, pausing outside each room to listen for anything unusual. Most of the residents were asleep, save for the occasional rustle of blankets or a quiet cough. Room 213 was at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to peek in. Mr. Holloway was awake. He was sitting up in bed, facing the window, his frail shoulders hunched. The room was dark except for the pale moonlight streaming through the curtains, casting long shadows across the walls. I knocked softly. "Mr. Holloway? Everything okay?" At first, he didn't react, just kept staring outside, his breath slow and steady. Then, after a long pause, he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his profile. His eyes were distant, lost. "She's out there," he murmured. I frowned, stepping inside. "Who's out there?" His thin fingers twitched against the blanket. "My wife, Helen." I followed his gaze to the window. The nursing home's courtyard stretched out below, patches of grass, a few scattered benches, and a large oak tree that stood near the far fence. But there was no one there. "Mr. Holloway," I said gently, "your wife passed away, remember?" He didn't look at me, didn't blink. "She comes every night," he whispered, "stands by the tree, watching." A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I glanced at the tree again, studying the way the moonlight bent around its gnarled branches. It cast a shadow across the grass, long and twisted, but that was all. Just a shadow. "Maybe it's a trick of the light," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "When it's dark like this, the shadows—" "It's her." His voice was firm now, certain. I didn't argue. Instead, I sat with him for a few minutes, talking quietly until he seemed to settle. When I finally left the room, he was still staring at the window, still waiting. The rest of the night was uneventful. I made my rounds, checked on the other residents, and tried to ignore the way the building felt. Different. Like it was listening. By 4 a.m., I was exhausted, counting the minutes until my shift ended. I was pouring myself a cup of stale coffee in the break room when I heard it, a voice. Soft, muffled. I froze, listening. It was coming from the hallway. I stepped out, following the sound. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from room 213 and 3/4. Mr. Holloway was talking, but he wasn't alone. There was another voice, low, whispering. My pulse quickened as I reached the door. It was still ajar, just enough for me to see inside. It was pushing. "Meeting." Mr. Holloway was sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room. His lips moved, murmuring something I couldn't make out. I opened my mouth to speak, then stopped, because the air changed. It was subtle at first, like the atmosphere had thickened, pressing, suffocating, and then I saw it. The shadow. It was just a shape, a dark smudge against the far wall, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't cast by the lamp. It wasn't moving like a shadow should. Mr. Holloway's voice trembled. "Why won't she answer me?" I stepped inside, forcing a smile. "Mr. Holloway, it's late. Let's get you back to sleep." His breath hitched. He looked at me for the first time all night, his face pale, terrified. "She's inside now," I swallowed hard. "There's no one here, sir." His frail hands gripped the blanket. "She's standing right behind you." Every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. Instead, I walked to the corner of the room and waved my hand through the air, trying to show him there was nothing there. But the second I did, the light flickered, and the shadow moved. Not across the wall, away from it, like it had stepped forward. A sharp, ice-cold chill swept through me, and suddenly the air felt heavy, like I was wading through something thick and invisible. I backed away quickly. "It's late, Mr. Holloway. Let's get you to bed." His eyes stayed locked on the corner. "She doesn't like you," he whispered. I didn't stay after that. I left his room, my heart hammering in my chest, and forced myself to finish my shift. By the time morning came, I'd made my decision. I quit. Whatever was in that room, whatever Mr. Holloway saw, I didn't want to see it too. As I walked out of Ridgway Manor for the last time, I glanced back at the building. The sun had risen, casting warm golden light across the windows. But room 213, it was still dark, like the shadow inside never left. After that night at Ridgway Manor, I told myself I wouldn't take another overnight job again. But bills don't wait, and fear doesn't keep the lights on. I lasted a whole 2 weeks unemployed before I caved and took a night shift as an office cleaner in downtown Seattle. At least it wasn't a nursing home, I told myself. No eerie old residents whispering about shadows in their rooms, no unseen figures watching from the corner, just an empty corporate building. Sterile, safe. I was wrong. The place was a towering glass and steel monstrosity, all sharp edges and polished floors, the kind of office where people in expensive suits made deals that ruined lives. I figured the worst thing I'd have to deal with was a roach skittering across the break room floor. My supervisor, Gail, was a woman in her 50s with a permanent frown and a cigarette voice that suggested she'd seen everything and cared about none of it. "You're on the 4th floor tonight," she said, handing me a key card and a laminated checklist. "Vacuum, empty the bins, wipe down the desks. No food in the offices, no valuables on the counters, no funny business." I nodded, trying to seem competent. Gail looked me over, then added, almost as an afterthought, "And if you run into Ethan, don't let him bother you." I paused. "Who's Ethan?" "The night janitor, been here longer than me. Harmless, but strange." She exhaled smoke, watching me carefully. "Just let him do his thing." I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd worked plenty of jobs with weird coworkers. A guy who talked to himself, a woman who smelled like gasoline, a boss who stole from the register and blamed it on ghosts. Ethan would just be another name on that list. The shift started out fine. The office was eerily quiet, just the hum of computers in sleep mode and the occasional click of the air vents. I moved from cubicle to cubicle, wiping down desks, vacuuming the carpets. Every now and then, I caught my reflection in the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a lone figure in an empty maze of glass. That's when I noticed him. At first I thought I imagined it, a shape at the end of the hall, just barely visible in my peripheral vision. When I turned my head, there was no one there. But then it happened again. A flicker of movement just outside my line of sight. The sound of footsteps that weren't mine. I told myself it was just my nerves. First nights were always weird. But then I heard the squeak of a cart's wheels. I turned a corner and nearly jumped out of my skin. Ethan was standing there. Tall, gaunt, wearing a faded janitor's uniform, his bony fingers wrapped around the handle of a cleaning cart. His skin was pale, almost gray under the fluorescent lights, and he had this unsettling way of looking at you, too long, too intense, like he was studying you instead of seeing you. His mouth curled into a grin, but his eyes stayed cold. "First night?" His voice was quiet, hoarse, like he didn't use it much. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just getting the hang of things." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Let me know if you need anything." Then he pushed his cart past me, the wheels squeaking. and disappeared into the dimly lit hallway. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The night wore on, and everywhere I went, I saw Ethan, at the end of the hallway, standing just out of the light, in the break room watching from the doorway, reflected in the glossy surface of a conference table when I turned my head. Never doing anything, just watching. I told myself it was coincidence. He was just working, same as me. But after the third or fourth time, my gut told me otherwise. By 2:45 a.m., I was counting down the minutes until my shift ended. I gathered my supplies, ready to head out, but when I reached the elevator, the button did nothing. I pressed it again, no response. A flicker of unease crawled up my spine. Fine, I'd take the stairs. I turned toward the stairwell door and stopped. It was slightly open, just a sliver of darkness between the door and the frame. I was sure it had been closed earlier. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, metal against concrete. It was coming from below. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped closer, peering down the stairwell. Nothing but shadows. The sound came again, closer this time. Then, from the darkness below, something moved. A figure stepped onto the landing one floor down. Ethan. He was standing perfectly still, facing the wall, his back to me. In his right hand, he held something. Long, heavy, a crowbar. I stepped back, heart hammering. Ethan turned his head slowly, just enough for me to see his profile. He was smiling. I bolted. I sprinted back down the hall, my footsteps pounding against the floor, my breath coming fast and ragged. I tried every door I passed. Locked. I reached another stairwell. The door gave way under my weight, and I flew down the steps, two at a time. Behind me, I heard footsteps, fast, heavy, coming after me. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran. When I hit the ground floor, I didn't bother with the main exit. I crashed through the emergency door, the alarm blaring behind me, and didn't stop running until I reached my car. I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I glanced back at the building, expecting to see Ethan standing in the doorway, but the lobby was empty. The next morning, I called Gail and quit. I didn't tell her what happened, didn't tell anyone. A few weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that Ethan had been fired. Something about making a coworker uncomfortable. No one gave details. I didn't ask. I don't know what Ethan's deal was, but I know one thing. He had been waiting for me. After what happened at the office in Seattle, I swore off night shifts for good. The eerie silence, the way shadows seemed longer, thicker, alive. It wasn't worth the paycheck. I told myself I'd stick to daytime jobs where the worst thing I had to deal with was office gossip and bad coffee. But then I moved to Charleston, and reality hit me like a brick to the face. Rent wasn't cheap, my savings were draining fast, and when you're desperate, you stop being picky. That's how I ended up at Branford and Myers, a small, dusty law office that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. I was hired as a paralegal, though my actual duties were much less glamorous than I'd imagined. No courtroom drama, no exciting legal battles, just filing documents, answering phones, and running errands. A lot of errands. My boss, Mr. Connors, was the kind of man who spoke in half sentences and expected you to read his mind. The office manager, Janice, had the dead-eyed look of someone who'd been here too long but didn't know how to leave. It wasn't great, but it wasn't the worst job I'd had. At least, that's what I thought, until the first errand. It was my third day on the job, and Janice handed me a manila envelope, sealed tight, with my name written on the front in thick black marker. No return address. No instructions except a single line on a sticky note. Deliver to 184 Whispering Pines. Do not knock, do not wait. I frowned. Is this legal paperwork? Janice didn't look up from her desk. Just drop it off. Something about it felt off. Should I get a signature? No, just leave it. I waited for more, but that was it. No explanation, no context. Just drop it off and leave. I plugged the address into my phone and immediately regretted it. Whispering Pines wasn't in the city. It wasn't even in the suburbs. It was out in the middle of nowhere, a winding road lined with nothing but trees and the occasional decaying barn. By the time I turned onto the final stretch, the sun was starting to dip, turning the sky a deep, bruised orange. That's when I saw the house, if you could even call it that. 184 Whispering Pines was abandoned. The two-story building looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. Boarded-up windows, a collapsing porch, weeds swallowing what was left of the front yard. There were no signs of life, no lights, no cars, no sounds, just an empty shell of a home waiting to be forgotten. I swallowed hard. Why the hell was I delivering a legal envelope here? I pulled up to the rusted mailbox at the end of the driveway, hesitated, then slipped the envelope inside. The metal groaned as I shut the lid, and for a moment everything was still. Then I felt it, that deep primal instinct that tells you someone is watching. I looked up, heart pounding, scanning the empty windows. That's when I saw it. A shadow, second floor, standing just behind the cracked glass of an uncovered window, watching me. I didn't move, couldn't. My breath caught in my throat, my hands frozen on the steering wheel. Then, just as the wind picked up, the figure stepped back, disappearing into the darkness. I floored it. The next morning, I walked into the office, hands still shaking, ready to tell Janice I wasn't doing any more delivery. But before I could even open my mouth, she handed me another manila envelope, same black marker, same "Deliver to 184 Whispering Pines." I stared at it. "You're kidding," Janice sighed. "It's part of the job. Who lives there?" She didn't answer. I clenched my jaw. "Janice." Her fingers drummed against her desk. Then, in a flat, measured voice, she said, "Just do what you're told." I shouldn't have gone back. Every fiber of my being told me to quit, to throw the damn envelope in the trash and never look back. But, against my better judgment, I drove back to that house. This time, the window on the second floor was open. Just a crack, like someone had been waiting. I tried to move fast, but my hands were slick with sweat as I shoved the envelope into the mailbox. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. The front door. It was ajar, not wide open, just enough to see into the dark, empty hallway beyond. A single handprint smeared in dust. Fresh. I turned to run, but something stopped me. A sound, soft, muffled, like someone whispering my name. From inside the house. I didn't look back. I drove back to the office, threw my keys on my desk, and walked straight to Janice. "I'm done." She didn't seem surprised. She just nodded, reached into her desk, and handed me a white envelope. My final paycheck. Inside, along with the check, was a note. "Stop asking questions." I didn't need to be told twice. I walked out of Branford and Myers, leaving behind the unanswered questions, the strange deliveries, and that abandoned house that wasn't really empty. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was inside that house is still waiting. Waiting for the next poor soul to deliver another envelope, and wondering why I never came back. After I left Draper's Books, I told myself I needed to be smarter about my next job. No more old buildings, no more strange doors, no more things that shouldn't move, moving. I needed something stable, something boring. So when I found a listing for an overnight assistant at a hospital morgue in Chicago, I figured it couldn't be that bad. Hospitals were full of people, well lit, and most importantly, real. I wasn't afraid of the dead, at least not yet. The hospital itself was massive, a sprawling concrete and glass fortress, humming with life even in the dead of night. But the morgue? That was different. It sat in the basement, far away from the noise of the living, sealed off from the rest of the building, like a forgotten limb. When I arrived, Dr. Patel, the senior pathologist, greeted me with a tired smile. She was in her late 40s, with dark circles under her eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that made me feel like a rookie on his first day of school. "You'll be working alone most nights," she said as she led me through the double doors. "Most of the bodies come in late. You process paperwork, keep things organized, and prep anything scheduled for autopsy the next morning." She stopped in front of a row of metal storage drawers, each labeled with a small white tag. "Don't worry, it's quiet down here." I forced a laugh. "Not like they're going anywhere, right?" Dr. Patel didn't laugh. She just looked at me, then gestured toward the far end of the room. "One more thing," she said, lowering her voice. "You might hear things at night. Noises from the old section of the morgue. If you do, ignore them. No one's been back there for years." I frowned. "Why?" she sighed, rubbing her temple. "There was an incident a long time ago. We don't talk about it." That should have been my cue to walk away, but I didn't. I needed the money. The first few nights were fine. The work was tedious but simple. Checking tags, filing paperwork, moving bodies when necessary. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional drip of water from the overhead pipes. But then, on my fourth night, I heard it. A soft metallic creak, like one of the body drawers sliding open. I turned, heart hammering, scanning the room. Nothing. I walked past the rows of drawers, running my fingers over the cool metal handles. All of them were shut. I shook it off. Old buildings made noise. But then it happened again. A slow, deliberate sound. A body drawer sliding open. This time I saw it. Drawer C7 near the back of the room had shifted open by an inch. A thin strip of darkness gaped between the metal and the cold tile. I took a step closer, my pulse thundering. I grabbed the handle and shoved it shut, the metal slamming with an echoing clang. For the rest of my shift, I avoided looking at C7. The next night, I checked the security feed before I even started my shift. The cameras showed the morgue, still and silent. No movement, no drawers opening, just me walking in. At 2:14 a.m., the footage glitched. For 3 seconds, the screen went dark. When it came back, C7 was open again. My breath caught in my throat. I rewound, played it again. Same thing. 1 second, the drawer was closed. The next, it was open. And in those 3 missing seconds, something shifted in the corner of the screen. A dark shape, too tall to be a shadow, too still to be alive. I slammed the laptop shut. The following night, I came in prepared. I locked C7 before my shift started. I checked it twice. It was sealed tight. By 1:45 a.m., I was on edge. My skin felt too tight, my ears straining for any sound. Then, footsteps. Faint, shuffling steps, coming from the old morgue. My throat went dry. Dr. Patel told me not to go back there. But something was moving in the dark. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped past the double doors. The old morgue was colder than the rest of the hospital, the air stagnant and wrong. Dust clung to the gurneys, untouched for years. The walls were lined with rows of ancient body drawers, their labels yellowed and peeling. I scanned the room with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick dark. Nothing. Then, a drawer clicked open. I spun around, my light flickering. Drawer B12 was ajar. My heart pounded against my ribs. The security feed flashed in my mind. 3 seconds of blackness. A shifting shape, a missing presence. I took a slow, shaky step forward. The air felt thick, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. I reached for the drawer, ready to shove it shut and run. Then, a breath. Not mine, coming from inside the drawer. I felt it before I saw it, a sharp, suffocating chill, a pressure that sent every nerve in my body into overdrive. And then, fingers. Pale, bony fingers curling over the edge of the drawer, gripping the metal. I stumbled back, my scream lodging in my throat. The drawer slid open further, revealing an empty slab. Nothing, no body, just cold air and the lingering imprint of something that had been there moments before. I ran. I didn't look back. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I called Dr. Patel and told her I was done. She didn't argue, she just sighed and said, "I understand." Then, just before she hung up, she added, "It happens to all of us." A week later, I was sitting in a coffee shop when a nurse I recognized from the hospital sat down across from me. She looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You worked the morgue, didn't you?" I nodded, my stomach twisting. She hesitated, then leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did anyone tell you why they shut down the old section?" I shook my head. She swallowed. "They lost a body, years ago. A man. He was gone. Just gone. They never found him. A chill ran down my spine. How does a body just disappear? I asked. She shook her head. I don't know, but some people say he never really left. I haven't set foot in a hospital since. After what happened at the hospital morgue, I told myself I'd never work another night shift. Ever. I wasn't built for this. The long, empty hours, the silence that wasn't really silence, the feeling that someone, something, was always just out of sight. But jobs weren't exactly lining up for me, and my savings were bleeding out fast. I needed work. Any work. That's how I ended up at the Desert Sun Motel, a rundown roadside lodge off the highway somewhere in Arizona. The kind of place where the neon sign flickered like a dying heartbeat and the paint peeled off the walls in long, curling strips. It wasn't luxury, but it was a paycheck. The owner, Mr. Fields, was an old guy with a permanent scowl and a limp that made every step sound like a ticking clock. He handed me a set of keys and muttered, "Don't rent out room 19. I frowned. "Why not?" He stopped, looked at me. His cloudy blue eyes didn't blink. Just don't. Then he walked out, leaving me alone at the front desk. The first couple of hours were quiet. A few tired travelers checked in, barely sparing me a glance as they took their keys and disappeared down the dimly lit hallway. By midnight, the lobby was empty. That's when the bell rang, a sharp metallic chime breaking the silence. I looked up. No one was there. The old service bell sat untouched on the counter, gleaming under the flickering fluorescent light. My stomach twisted. Maybe the wind had knocked something over. Maybe I was just jumpy from the last job. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw the logbook. The pages flipped on their own, stopping at a blank guest entry, room 19. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed the book, running my fingers over the empty space where a name should have been. No one had checked in to room 109. I knew that. Then why was the page filled out like someone had? I forced myself to stay behind the counter, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles ached. I wasn't going to check. I wasn't going to check. Then the security monitor flickered, a grainy black and white feed of the hallway. I watched as the door to room 109 creaked open, slowly, deliberately. The hallway was empty. But the door moved. I stared at the screen, waiting, hoping it was just a glitch. Then, on the monitor, something stepped out of the room. My stomach dropped. A shadow. Tall. Wrong. It didn't have a face. Just a shape that looked like a person, but wasn't. And then it turned toward the camera. I slammed the monitor off. I sat behind the counter, breathing hard, my hands shaking. The room felt too cold now. The air thick and damp like the inside of a grave. I had two choices: leave the desk and lock myself in the back office, or check the hallway. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was too scared to sit still. Maybe my body just moved on its own. But before I knew it, I was standing in the hallway, staring at the door to room 19.org. It was open, just a crack. The air smelled wrong, stale, like old fabric and something else. Something rotting. I took a step forward. From inside the room, I heard my name, a whisper, a voice that wasn't mine but sounded too close. I turned to run. The door slammed shut. I gasped, my heart hammering, my pulse pounding in my ears. From behind the door, I heard breathing, slow, deep, too loud. I scrambled back to the desk, grabbed my keys, and ran. I quit the next morning. Didn't even wait to see Mr. Fields. Just left the keys on the counter and walked out. A week later, I checked the motel's website. It had closed down. No explanation, no final message, just gone. I don't know who or what was in room 199, but I know this. It knew my name, and I think it's still waiting for me. If there's one thing I've learned from these experiences, it's this. Always trust your instincts. Fear isn't just some irrational emotion. It's your body's way of telling you something isn't right, that something unseen is lurking just beyond your understanding. Each of these stories had something in common. A warning ignored, a gut feeling dismissed, a curiosity that should have been left alone. We like to tell ourselves that logic and reason will keep us safe, that if we can't explain it, it must not be real. But tell me this, how many times have you felt eyes on you in an empty room? How often have you heard a noise in your house when you knew you were alone? Maybe we brush these things off because we have to, because it's easier to pretend nothing is there than to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, something is. For Ben Carter, it was the lingering presence in room 2013, an unseen visitor watching from the corner of a lonely man's room. For Laura Mitchell, it was a coworker who wasn't just watching, but waiting. Toby Reynolds delivered letters to an abandoned building only to realize he was leaving something behind, but something else was watching him in return. Emily Hawthorne learned the hard way that locked doors are locked for a reason, and when they open on their own, you don't stick around to see why. James Riker thought the dead stayed dead, but some things refused to rest. And as for Carla Sanchez, when the register logs a guest that doesn't exist, when a door opens to a room that's supposed to stay closed, you don't check inside, you leave. So if you ever find yourself in a situation that feels wrong, don't second guess yourself. Leave, quit, run if you have to, because the truth is, you don't always get an answer. Sometimes, the only thing worse than not knowing what's out there is finding out. And if you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with me. Enigma of the Unknown is built for those who, like me, question the world beyond the ordinary, the whispers in the dark, the doors that should stay locked. If you enjoyed these stories, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next unsettling tale. And tell me in the comments, which story haunted you the most? Stay safe, stay aware, and whatever you do, trust your instincts.